March 7th, 1945, 1:27 p.m., west bank of the Rhine River, Germany. I've been driving this Sherman tank for 8 months straight. 8 months of hedgerows in Normandy, frozen foxholes in the Ardennes, and shattered German towns that all looked the same after a while. My hands knew every lever, every gauge, every vibration of the engine without thinking. But standing in that commander's hatch, binoculars pressed against my face, staring at what shouldn't have been possible, my hands were shaken for the first time since D-Day. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing, not destroyed, not collapsed into the Rhine like every other bridge we'd encountered for 300 miles, just standing there. Black steel girders crossing the widest river in Western Europe, connecting us to the heart of Nazi Germany. I could see German soldiers running across it, tiny figures, maybe 1,000 yards away, scrambling like ants whose hill had been kicked over. "Sullivan, you seeing what I'm seeing?" Lieutenant Barnes' voice crackled through the intercom, tight with something between disbelief and terror. "Yes, sir. Bridge is up. Repeat, bridge is up." The radio erupted, every frequency suddenly alive with voices overlapping, commanders shouting coordinates, infantry requesting orders, artillery asking for fire missions. The entire United States First Army had just discovered that the impossible was real, and nobody knew quite what to do about it. Behind us, the town of Remagen burned. We'd taken it that morning after house-to-house fighting that left the narrow streets choked with rubble and the acrid smell of cordite. Civilians had emerged from cellars, pale and hollow-eyed, carrying white flags from bedsheets. Some wept, others just stared. The war had finally reached the Rhine, and they knew what that meant. But the bridge, God, the bridge! I'd been briefed on German demolition capabilities. Hitler's engineers had destroyed every crossing over the Rhine with methodical precision. Cologne's bridges, gone. Koblenz, gone. Mainz, Worms, Mannheim, all dropped into the river before we could get within artillery range. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's last natural defense, a quarter-mile-wide moat that would buy them time. Maybe enough time to negotiate surrender terms. Maybe enough time to develop whatever wonder weapons Goebbels kept promising on Radio Berlin. The Germans weren't supposed to make mistakes, not about something this important. "All units, this is Colonel Engman. Prepare to assault the bridge. I repeat, prepare to assault the bridge." The order came through clear, but the weight of it settled in my chest like a stone. Assault? Cross a bridge that could be rigged to explode at any second? Drive a 30-ton Sherman tank across steel and concrete that German engineers had undoubtedly packed with enough explosives to send the whole structure into the Rhine? Sergeant Miller, my gunner, spoke up from below. "Frank, they wouldn't send us across if it wasn't safe, right?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because I'd seen what happened at Nijmegen back in September, when British tanks tried to cross that bridge while Germans detonated charges underneath them. I'd watched from 2 miles away through binoculars as steel and concrete and human beings were transformed into a fountain of debris that rose 300 feet into the Dutch sky. "Load HE," I said instead. "Target any demo charges you can spot on the bridge structure." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of the Rhine. It smelled like industry and old stone, like every river in Germany that had carried the weight of armies for 1,000 years. Above us, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds that threatened snow. March in Germany. Still winter, despite what the calendar said. I could see German troops establishing defensive positions on the eastern bank. Machine gun nests, artillery observers. They knew we were coming. They knew this bridge was the most valuable piece of real estate in Western Europe at this moment. Every German soldier between here and Berlin would be racing toward Remagen by nightfall. The mathematics were simple and terrifying.
If we took this bridge intact, we could pour the entire First Army across the Rhine in days, surround the Ruhr industrial heartland, cut Germany in half. If we failed, or if the bridge collapsed under us, we'd given the Germans a propaganda victory and bought them precious weeks to regroup. Charlie Company, move out. Our column lurched forward. 5 Sherman tanks, infantry from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion riding on our decks, and behind us, the entire 9th Armored Division preparing to follow. I could hear the infantry talking, their voices floating up through the engine noise. Young voices, most of them. Kids from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Illinois who'd been in Europe for less than 6 months. "Stay low once we hit the bridge," I called back to them. "German 88s will be zeroing in on the span. Don't bunch up, and for God's sake, don't stop moving." We rolled through Remagen's eastern streets. Civilians watched from windows, their faces impossible to read. Were they hoping we'd succeed? Afraid we would? After years of Allied bombing and now the ground war reaching their homes, I suspected they were just numb, just waiting for it to be over, one way or another.
The bridge approach appeared ahead, a gradual incline leading up to the western portal, where the bridge deck began its span across the Rhine. I could see the towers now, massive stone structures with Gothic arches that had stood since 1918. Railroad tracks ran down the center of the bridge, with pedestrian walkways on either side, wide enough for tanks if you didn't think too hard about the weight limits. "Contact! Enemy infantry, bridge approach, 2 o'clock!" Miller's voice was sharp, professional. The Sherman 75mm gun swung right, smooth as silk, despite the rough cobblestones beneath our tracks. I spotted them, German engineers in field gray uniforms, working frantically around what looked like a control panel built into the base of the western tower. "Fire!" The cannon bucked, and the high explosive shell screamed across 400 yards in less than a second. The explosion enveloped the German position in gray smoke and stone fragments. When it cleared, the control panel was a twisted mass of metal, and the engineers had disappeared. But how many more charges were there? How many backup detonators? How many desperate German officers with their fingers on buttons that could send us all to the bottom of the Rhine? We hit the bridge approach at 15 miles per hour, fast enough to be aggressive, slow enough to keep the infantry on our hull. The steel deck plates rang beneath our tracks, a hollow metallic sound that cut through the engine noise. Ahead of us, the span stretched out like something from a nightmare, 600 feet of exposed crossing with no cover, no concealment, just naked steel and the Rhine flowing beneath. German machine guns opened up from the eastern towers. Tracers arced across the bridge deck, bright even in the afternoon light. The infantry on our hull pressed themselves flat against the armor, returning fire with their rifles, useless at this range, but it gave them something to do besides think about dying. "Keep moving," Barnes' voice. "Don't stop for anything." The bridge shuddered, a deep, gut-level vibration that traveled up through the tracks and into my bones. For one eternal second, I thought this was it, the explosions, the collapse, the end. But the bridge held, just held. Maybe that had been artillery impact on the eastern bank. Maybe a near-miss bomb from a German aircraft we hadn't spotted. Maybe nothing at all, just old steel under stress. Halfway across now, the Rhine stretched out below us, gray and cold and moving fast with mountain snowmelt. If we went in, the Sherman would sink like a stone. The crew might get out if we were lucky. The infantry on the hull wouldn't have a chance. 30-ton anchor pulling them down into darkness and cold water and the end of everything. I could see the eastern bank in detail now. German troops running, some toward the bridge, some away from it. Officers screaming orders that nobody seemed to be following. The confusion of an army that had spent 5 years advancing and now found itself in full retreat, unsure who was in command or what orders to obey. "Look, the towers!" One of the infantry pointed upward.
I followed his finger and saw it. German engineers climbing the inside of the eastern towers, heading toward what had to be demolition charges planted in the structure. They were going to blow it manually. Without a detonator, without time to evacuate, they were going to sacrifice themselves to drop this bridge. Miller, targets in the eastern tower, high explosive, rapid fire. The cannon spoke 3 times in quick succession. The first shell punched through the tower's stonework. The second and third followed, and I saw bodies tumbling from the interior, saw flashes of secondary explosions as demo charges cooked off prematurely. But we were still on the bridge, still exposed, still one good explosion away from catastrophe. Contact front! German armor, eastern approach! A Panther tank had appeared from the tree line 500 yards past the bridge. Its 75mm gun was already transversing towards us, and I knew with absolute certainty that we couldn't win a gunnery duel at this range. The Panther's armor would shrug off our 75mm shells. One shot from them would penetrate our Sherman's glacis plate and turn the interior into a slaughterhouse. "Infantry, dismount and take cover!" I screamed. "Miller, smoke! Give us smoke!" The white phosphorus shell burst directly in front of the Panther, creating a wall of thick white smoke that billowed across the eastern approach. It wouldn't last long, maybe 30 seconds, but it might be enough. "Full throttle! Get us off this bridge!" The Sherman lurched forward, engine screaming, tracks hammering across the steel deck plates. 20 yards, 10 yards, the eastern bank rushing towards us. Solid ground, blessed solid ground! The Panther fired blind through the smoke. I felt the shell pass overhead, so close that the pressure wave made my ears ring. It struck the bridge deck behind us, right where we'd been 3 seconds earlier, and the steel plates buckled upward from the impact. Then we were off the bridge, tracks biting into German soil, the Sherman slewing right behind a concrete pillbox that would give us cover from the Panther's next shot. "We're across the Rhine!" Miller's voice was high-pitched, almost hysterical with relief. "Jesus Christ, we're across the Rhine!"
I grabbed the radio microphone, my hands somehow steady again now that we'd survived. "Bridge secure on eastern bank. Repeat, bridge secure. Send the engineers." Behind us, more Shermans were already rolling across the Ludendorff, their commanders probably feeling the same mixture of terror and exhilaration that was coursing through my veins. Infantry were flooding across on foot now, spreading out on the eastern bank, establishing a perimeter. And somewhere back in Remagen, combat engineers were racing forward with their equipment, preparing to sweep the bridge for demolitions and shore up any structural damage. The Panther had withdrawn, disappearing back into the tree line. Smart crew. They knew what was coming now. Knew that within hours this bridgehead would be swarming with American armor and artillery, and their solitary tank wouldn't change anything. I climbed out of the commander's hatch, legs shaking as I dropped to the ground. The earth felt solid beneath my boots, more real than anything it felt in the past 15 minutes. Around me, infantry were digging foxholes with frantic energy, knowing that German counterattacks would come soon. Lieutenant Barnes appeared, his face pale beneath the dirt and gun smoke. "Frank, God damn, we did it." "Yes, sir, we did." I turned to look back at the bridge. From this side, it looked even more fragile, even more impossible that we'd just driven 30 tons of armor across it, while German engineers tried to blow it up beneath us. The steel was scarred with bullet impacts and shell craters. One of the western towers showed visible damage from our fire. But it stood. Against all probability, all logic, all reason, it stood. Over the next 9 days, the Ludendorff Bridge would carry more than 8,000 vehicles and 25,000 troops across the Rhine. Combat engineers would work around the clock to shore up the structure, discover and disarm German demolition charges, and repair battle damage. German artillery would pound it continuously. Luftwaffe pilots would fly suicide missions trying to destroy it. And on March 17th, with Allied forces firmly established on the eastern bank, the bridge would finally collapse into the Rhine, killing 28 American engineers who were working on its deck when the overstressed structure gave way. But by then, it wouldn't matter. By then, we'd built pontoon bridges alongside it. By then, the First Army was already driving deep into Germany. By then, the war in the West was effectively over, even if it would take another 2 months of fighting to make it official. I didn't know any of that on March 7th. Standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine, watching more of our tanks roll across that impossible bridge, I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. We'd been given a gift, a miracle, a moment when everything that could have gone wrong somehow went right instead. The Germans had made a mistake, the first real mistake I'd seen them make in 8 months of combat. Someone had failed to blow the demolitions properly. Someone had panicked, someone had miscalculated, and that someone had handed us the key to ending the war. Sergeant Miller came up beside me, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You think they'll put us in the history books for this?" I watched another Sherman roll safely across the bridge, his commander waving as he passed. Maybe. Probably. Does it matter? I guess not. I just want to go home. I want to see my girl in Pittsburgh again. I want to sit on my mom's porch and drink lemonade and forget that any of this ever happened. Yeah, me too. But I knew I wouldn't forget. Couldn't forget. The image of that bridge, black steel against gray sky, German tracers arcing across the span, the Rhine flowing dark and cold beneath us. That image would be with me forever. In my dreams, in my nightmares, in quiet moments when I closed my eyes and suddenly found myself back in that commander's hatch, heart pounding, watching the eastern bank rushing toward us while death waited at every second. The bridge at Remagen saved thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. By allowing Allied forces to cross the Rhine weeks ahead of schedule, it shortened the war, prevented a prolonged German defense, stopped Hitler from having time to deploy whatever desperate weapons his scientists were developing in those underground factories. But standing there that afternoon, watching the miracle unfold in real time, I wasn't thinking about grand strategy or a historical significance. I was thinking about Miller's girl in Pittsburgh, about the infantry boys who'd ridden on our hull across that span, and how they'd get to go home to Ohio and Pennsylvania and Illinois because we'd made it across alive. I was thinking about the German engineers who died trying to blow the bridge. Young men, probably. Conscripts, following orders just like us. They'd failed in their mission, and that failure doomed their country, but I couldn't hate them for it. War had made us enemies, but it had also made us the same. Just men trying to survive, trying to do our duty, trying to make it home. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, casting long shadows across the battlefield. In that brief light, I could see the full scope of what we'd accomplished. American forces on both sides of the Rhine, the bridge standing like a defiant middle finger pointed at Berlin, artillery being set up, supply trucks queuing to cross, medics treating the wounded, and engineers working to ensure that what we'd seized would stay seized. It was beautiful, in a terrible sort of way. The end of something, the beginning of something else. By nightfall, we'd established a perimeter 2 miles deep on the eastern bank. German counterattacks came, probed by infantry, artillery barrages, even a few tanks that emerged from the darkness and were destroyed by our tank destroyers. But nothing could dislodge us now. We held. We held because the bridge gave us a continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies. We held because we'd been given an opportunity we couldn't waste. And we held because men like Miller and Barnes and the anonymous infantry who'd ridden on our hull across that span were willing to risk everything for that crossing. I spent that night in a hastily dug foxhole, wrapped in a blanket that didn't quite keep out the March cold, listening to the sounds of war continuing around us. Artillery rumbling in the distance, small arms fire from probing attacks on our perimeter. The distinctive sound of German machine guns, different from ours, carrying across the darkness. And underneath it all, I could hear the Rhine, the constant whisper of moving water, flowing from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, carrying the weight of history and blood and everything that war had made of Europe. I thought about the bridge, wondered how long it would last, wondered if it would still be standing tomorrow or next week or next month, wondered if future generations would remember this day, or if it would just become another footnote in history books, overshadowed by bigger battles and more famous victories.
but I knew one thing for certain. March 7th, 1945, was the day the Rhine was crossed, the day Germany's last natural defense fell, the day the end became inevitable, even if the dying wasn't over yet. I'd driven my Sherman tank across that bridge, survived it, carried infantry into the heart of Germany on my hull, played my small part in something larger than any individual soldier could comprehend. And when I finally did make it home, when the war ended and we sailed back to New York Harbor, and I saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time in 2 years, I would carry the memory of that bridge with me. The black steel, the gray river, the impossible crossing that became possible because men chose to be brave in the face of terror. The bridge at Remagen would fall on March 17th, but by then, it had already served its purpose, already changed the course of the war, already saved more lives than were lost in taking it. And somewhere in Germany, in the chaos of their collapsing Reich, German officers were writing reports about the miracle that had failed, the bridge that should have been destroyed, the demolitions that somehow didn't fire properly, the opportunity that slipped through their fingers. They'd been one button push away from victory, one successful detonation from buying themselves weeks or months more time. But war isn't decided by what almost happened. It's decided by what did happen. And what happened on March 7th, 1945 was simple. We crossed the Rhine. We took the bridge at Remagen. We changed history.